Two people who are following the situation in Georgia very closely are Nick Corasaniti. He's New York Times domestic correspondent, who wrote about the effect the new legislation would have on black voters in the state, particularly black churches' roles in those elections. And Georgia State Representative Renitta Shannon, who spoke up on the floor of the Georgia House of Representatives as Republicans proposed new restrictive voter legislation. Representative Shannon, let me start with you. I mean, your state has been famous for this. It has been the site of these sort of epic battles. What's different now? What's new now? What do you want to say to Americans about what's happening in the state right now?
Well, you're correct. Georgia has been doing this year after year. When I was first elected, I served on the Governmental Affairs Committee, which deals with election law. And every year I've seen nothing but bills come through meant to make it harder for everyone to vote. What's different now is that what's happening in Georgia has been happening across the country, and it's very well coordinated. This year in particular, Republicans are going after black and brown voters with targeted precision to make sure that they cannot show up in the ways that they did in the November and the U.S. Senate races. They want to make sure that that turnout never happens again.
Nick, you wrote a great piece about one of the specific aspects of the proposed legislations, targeting really voter mobilization efforts by black churches. What's going on there?
Well, one of the provisions in the omnibus bill that was passed by the House severely limits weekend voting. It allows only one Sunday per election cycle for the polls to be open, and even that's up to the local registrar in the biggest counties. And traditionally, voting on Sundays has been very popular in black communities, and black churches take a kind of central role in making sure communities are engaged, that their voting rights are protected. They'll help them register to vote. They'll help them get their absentee ballots if that's how they choose. And they'll also help with simple things like transportation. The phrase souls to the polls has been very popular, pretty much since the 1990s. And what this bill does is, by removing that, it starts a kind of, systemic way of trying to suppress the votes of the black community. And by taking away Sunday voting and then making it harder to vote absentee as well, they're then maybe going to create lines and make that even harder in some of these communities. So when you take away the role of the black church by taking away voting on Sundays, it's just going to kind of have a real trickle-down effect.
Representative, there's obviously a bill, a national bill, H.R. 1, that Democrats would like to see passed that would set some minimum standards. And I thought it was interesting, Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana said this about that piece of legislation: Democrats are selling out their own voters in a brazen attempt to permanently solidify their majority. States make their own voting laws, not the federal government. This power grab is shameful. I mean, the history here is, we have the 15th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act precisely because states like Georgia and others chose to make their own voting laws in obviously discriminatory ways.
And what's really interesting, it's so rich that Senator Cassidy would even say that, because even in Georgia, when you look at HB 531, the omnibus bill that you were just referring to, that bill specifically takes away local control. Republicans have railed forever about how important local control is. That bill moves local control away from the counties, who have historically had the responsibility of deciding what is the best way to facilitate voting for their residents. That bill takes that power away, gives a lot of it to the state. So there's a state takeover committee that's in that bill. And then it also puts a lot of the onus on the registrars. So they can't have it both ways. You can't rail for local control consistently and then, negate those principles. And so you see how far they are willing to go just to make sure that black and brown voters can never show up in the ways that they did in the previous elections.
Brad Raffensperger, who is, of course, Secretary of State, Nick, a Republican, who has both sided with state Republicans on some fights over voter restriction. He's been very critical of New Voter Project group that was started by Stacey Abrams, but also pushed back against Trump. He said this, which I think is interesting. At the end of the day, many of these bills are reactionary to a 3-month disinformation campaign that could have been prevented. In your reporting, have you heard Georgian politicians invoke the lie of the election being stolen as justification for these measures?
Yes, it's almost the sole justification. The two things that you hear repeatedly are that there are concerns about the election, there's a lack of confidence in the November election, and that we need to restore the confidence of our voters or our constituents who have concerns about the election. And as you mentioned earlier, there was no issues in Georgia, no major issues whatsoever. There were 3 different audits that all affirmed the results, and there was no issues in the runoff elections either. So kind of what you're seeing, and I think you're seeing this in other states as well, you mentioned Iowa earlier, is that some of these voting laws are almost becoming, a way to appease some of the more conservative parts of the Republican base, people who are very loyal to former President Trump. They want to see changes just because they're unhappy and they have doubts due to all of the lies and the disinformation that was spread online and, coming from the former president himself. So I think when you look at the justification that you hear a lot of, there's talk of securing the vote after an election that was very secure, and talk of rebuilding confidence for some voters when it was a very safe, secure, and smooth election given all the circumstances.
And quickly, Representative, I mean, both in Iowa and Georgia, right? Very different states, very different makeups demographically, and very different results. Like, Republicans did very well in Iowa. But in both states, you've got a state GOP that doesn't look and say, hey, that was a really high turnout election. We crushed it. They're in both states, regardless of the outcome, saying the same thing of like, we cannot let that happen again.
Well, and what's interesting is, so Brad Raffensperger, Secretary of State, and Gabriel Sterling have been hailed as heroes for standing up to Trump. But to your point, states across the country, whether Trump did well or not, are moving forward with these same tactics. And that's because all of them, including the Secretary of State and Gabriel Sterling, have been they were all telling the big lie before the president was.
Right.
Republicans have been talking about voter fraud, this mysterious voter fraud that they never can come up with any evidence to support, but they've been talking about it forever. And finally, what has happened is they have lost a major election. Their voters don't like it, and they are having to enact policies now to satisfy these voters because they've been lying to them for decades about voter fraud that does not exist.
All right, Nick Corasanidi of the New York Times, Representative Renitta Shannon down there in Georgia. Thank you both.